So welcome to part 2 of this lecture, where we're going to focus on causation. I'm going to start with a couple of quotes from historians reflecting on the nature of causation in their work as professional historians and writers of history. Herbert Butterfield in 1955 pointed out that the margin of choices made by individuals is like a small segment cut out of the great circle of necessity. If any such margin is granted at all, it's sufficient to alter the character of all history. So really pointing out here that there's a really important distinction to be made between things, between the scope that individuals have to make decisions which will influence how history unfolds, and the confining forces that will limit that scope. And so constantly there is this sense within how we construct and make sense of history that individuals make history, but they do so within social conditions which constrain the choices available to them. So whilst we have to recognise that individuals make a difference, we also have to recognise how they are influenced by the context in which they operate. So when we're talking about causation, we need to think about both of those dimensions. Here's an example from Lawrence Stone, who wrote a very influential book on the causes of the English Revolution. And he talks explicitly about this in relation to how his book was received and how people have discussed it over time. He says the model of preconditions, precipitants and triggers is a convenient organisational device for sorting out a huge mass of very diverse factors. So here he's being explicit and saying, there's a hell of a lot of history, there's a hell of a lot of stuff happened at the beginning of the Civil War, and so the historian has to categorise it and think of a way to relate these things to each other to provide a meaningful explanation. So he says some critics have accused his book of arguing that the English Revolution was inevitable. But, he says, there's a clear distinction between logically necessary consequences which derive from the abstract nature of given historical structures and hypothetical propositions that link together actual events and people, and which are by their nature merely probabilistic and dependent for their realisation upon specific contingencies. So he's saying here that in constructing an explanation as to why something as huge as the English Civil War, or as he calls it, the English Revolution, happened, he's not therefore arguing that nothing else could have happened, but he is saying that we need to understand that the probability of a relationship between these factors is what the historian can draw out. So we have to explain why something becomes increasingly likely to happen, why it becomes increasingly difficult to imagine something else happening. But that's not arguing that something had to happen. So there's, again, a fine line here in how we construct historical causation. Now, I started with this because I just want to show that this isn't something that teachers are making up or claiming as a particularly distinctive area of their work, that this actually emerges from the way that historians talk about their professional practice as well, and as a particularly interesting and contentious area of historical explanation at that. So Scott looked at how we teach causation in England a number of decades ago, I think about 30 years ago. Back in the day then, it would be common if you were given a question in an exam on why something happened, that the examiner would just be looking for a list of factors. So if you want to say why the English Civil War happened, then maybe they're just looking for 7 key factors, because at some point the people that wrote the history textbooks have decided there were 7 key arguments that when you stack them up next to each other, they explain why the Civil War broke out. And Scott didn't like this. He felt that remembering factors wasn't the same as offering a real explanation as to why something happened. And so he went back to grassroots really and said, if you're starting with a blank sheet and you could get rid of this exam structure that just imposed factual recall and treated causes like they were facts, what would causal reasoning really look like? And he forwarded this as his best guess, really. First of all, he said children would start off with no sense of why things happen, they would just happen. Then they might develop a mechanistic model and just say, well, X caused Y. One thing was enough. So the English Civil War was caused by having a bad king who wasn't very nice to people. Later on, at a more developed stage, they might look for more than one cause, and they'd understand that more than one cause can happen simultaneously. The interaction of causes makes events unique because there are no similar events that can be triggered by the exact same constellation of causes in the same context. And they might recognise that the historian can explain causation differently to participants than people at the time could have done, and they might start to sort causes into different factors. So we might start to notice that some things are to do with people's religious beliefs, some things are to do with the economy and their access to wealth, etc. So the fourth level of understanding Scott was putting forward at this stage was that students could understand some causal factors were more significant than others, and causation was seen more as a net of interlocking factors. So different factors could interrelate, and they could understand the historian's role in selecting those factors. So they begin to see factors not just kind of stacking up one after the other, but that they work in a network of influence with each other, and that the historian, him or herself, is having a hand in constructing this account of causation. And then finally, he says at the highest level we could imagine there's an understanding of historiography and explanations in context. We understand historians' explanations are interpretations and constructions, and we acknowledge the balance between chance and free will and determined events. So that's at the most sophisticated level. So we need to bear this in mind, because we're going to look at a couple of other models of progression in the rest of this lecture and in the reading for this week. And this is useful as a starting point because this was Scott's best guess. Having taught and studied history, this is what he thought would operate as an explanation as to how people make progress and how they deepen their understanding of this term. And we'll be able to compare in a little while how accurate this was when we compare it to the empirical work that was carried out on how children actually engage with this concept. So Project Chatter, which is the acronym for Concepts of Historical and Teaching Approaches, was undertaken by a number of academics based at the Institute of Education in London in the 1990s and early 2000s, and they did just that. They went about looking at how children engage in practice with the notion of causation, and then they tried to work up models of progression based on what children actually do and say when you speak to them in the classroom. And this is the kind of task that they took out into the field with them and gave to children. So they said to children, we start with this statement: the Romans were able to take over Britain because, and then they asked them to pick the best two choices to complete the statement. So you might want to do this as we read through this. So we're looking for two cards that explain or that complete the statement. So the Romans were able to take over Britain because, 1, the army trained a lot and its soldiers were used to fighting as a team. 2, the Roman Emperor Claudius ordered the invasion of Britain. 3, the Romans wanted to make sure they could get tin and pearls from the Britons. 4, Claudius wanted to show that he was a great emperor. 5, the Britons lived in different groups and sometimes fought each other. And 6, the Emperor Claudius had a limp. Now, all of these are historically true statements, but only 2 of them really work to complete that initial phrase. Now, the 2 that really work are 1 and 5. So the Romans were able to take over Britain because the Roman army trained a lot and its soldiers were used to fighting as a team. So they were able to take over Britain because they had a good, solid fighting force. And because the Britons lived in different groups and sometimes fought each other. So the Romans were united and strong and trained. The Britons were divided and there was a degree of infighting. Now the others are true, and they might explain why the Romans ended up here. So let's say number 3, the Romans wanted to make sure they could get tin and pearls. That's why it was of interest to them to conquer Britain. But if Britain was strong, united and fantastic at fighting, then they may not have been able to take Britain over. They would have just tried. So 1 and 5 are the right causes. They're the best choices. What's interesting is how many children do and don't get that answer right. So at age 7, most children get it wrong. Only 28% manage to pick 2 causes that make sense. By the age of 10, which is the end of primary school, certainly here where the study was conducted at the end of primary school, there's a 50-50 chance of whether kids get it right or wrong. By the first year of secondary school, 80% are getting it right, and 2 years later, only marginally more are getting it right. So there seems to be a kind of crossover point as they get to secondary school where children are developing this slightly better sense of what constitutes a causal relationship. So when asked why do things happen, the types of answers changed over time as well. So in the last slide we were looking at the accuracy of answers, but if we asked a more general question, why did the Roman army conquer Britain, as the Project Chatter researchers did, and then they categorized the answers by intention. Think about that. That's to do with the fact that the emperor wanted to conquer Britain, or the Romans wanted to get their hands on tin. So that's about intention. Situation are contextual factors, and then a combination of both. You can see here that there's a very definite reduction in the number of answers which focus on individuals or groups of people's motivations, and a rise in people's answers becoming more sophisticated, combining context and individual motivation. But interestingly, with the younger children, we're overwhelmingly dealing with people who think history happens because other people want it to happen that way, or people want something to change or to happen strongly enough. But it's also interesting to think in the secondary classroom, a quarter of children are still focusing on individual intention. And that is important, because very often then we're moving into quite advanced political and economic history, and it's important for us to realise that when we might be offering explanations that are at fairly kind of abstract and conceptual levels, many of our children will be looking for individuals and be looking for simplistic notions of individual intention or desire or will. So when asked to explain their answers about causation, the following types of reasons were predominant. Personal factors, so explaining why something happens because of the individual. So we might think about the general and what kind of a person he was, or the emperor. The second are role-related factors, so just the fact that the emperor at that time had an immense amount of power and could mobilize forces without internal opposition. So that's something to do with the office rather than with the individual characteristics of the person. And then situational factors, something to do with the strength of the Roman Empire, the resources that they could muster. So again, we see a similar change going on, really a shift away from personal factors and a shift towards situational factors. And that's the kind of shift in thinking that we need to be aware of as we are planning our secondary, post-primary education, that we are helping children make that shift away from personalising history and historical change to understanding broader context-related and slightly more abstract conceptual-related explanatory frameworks. So one of the early ways that the Chatter researchers came up with a model to describe this was to say there are three broad levels of understanding. We'll look at a more detailed version of this later on when we come to the reading, but at this stage this is what came out of their first tranche of empirical research, that we might start with younger children focusing on motivation and personal factors. For example, the Romans conquered Britain because they were ordered to, or because their leaders wanted them to. A more developed sense of causation would be a focus on roles, although this might often be simplified and stereotyped. For example, what do you expect? The emperor wanted to conquer Britain. That's what emperors are like. Emperors are crazy about expanding their territory and becoming stronger and stronger. So it's not related to the personal motivation of Claudius, but it is related to a slightly simplified notion of what someone does when they're in their office. And then finally, we come to an understanding of the logic of the situation. For example, the ability to differentiate between what led the Romans to try and the factors that led to them being successful. So there are reasons for action and there are causes for outcomes. And here pupils are able to understand that judgments made in the past will not be the same as those made from the present standpoint. So it's not always evident that people in the time we're studying would have been able to construct the same sense of why something is happening, because they're in the middle of it, because they are partial in their interpretation of events, and because they don't have the benefit of hindsight. They can't get the big picture. So when they pull this together, they say there are 3 broad dimensions to changes in children's understanding of historical change and causation. So the first dimension is to explain the outcomes of action. And as we go down the list, the Chatter researchers are claiming that this describes causation. So we go down the list, but we're rising up in terms of cognitive demand. So we start off wanting things with the concept that wanting things makes them happen. We then move on to desires only make things happen if they're strong enough. And then we understand that even strong desires require a mechanism to account for those outcomes. And finally, we understand that desires on their own can't account for outcomes. So that's what a sense of progression might look like when we're working on children in relation to this dimension of their understanding of historical change. The second dimension is causal structure. So the simplest is single items or separate items that have a cumulative effect in order to cause events. The next, in terms of moving on, in terms of sophistication, is that items connect in a linear fashion, but the order is not massively unimportant. So if the king upsets Parliament and then Parliament try to impose their will and there's an argument, and then an important leader emerges, it wouldn't really matter if an important leader emerged and then Parliament had an argument with the king and then the king came to Parliament and said he was going to dismiss them. So it doesn't really matter what order things happen in. The fact is you need to get the factors lined up. But then we get to the point, the next level of sophistication, the order in the chain is determined by content, and we might cluster factors around the same thing. The next level is to understand that temporal order fixes relationships in a chain. So there was a sequence in which events happened. But this is limited because it means that we're not really differentiating between the sequence in which things happened and any kind of causation. So as we get more sophisticated, we should be thinking about how events are the outcomes of linear structures with causal links between those items. So we start to understand that we can explain it's not just putting the causes into the sequence in which they happen, but it's actually understanding how one thing leads to the other, or how one thing is interconnected with the other. So instead of listing factors, we can list factors, put them in an order, and then justify the order and talk about the relationship between those factors in order. And then finally, we can come to the recognition that events are produced by complex structures of independent or linked chains with multiple links between items. Now, this is based on their analysis of empirical work. This is what children are doing in the classroom, and then what they're saying to the researchers about their work. What strikes me is that this is very similar to that very first model we looked at, which was just based on an experienced practitioner guessing what a model of progression would look like. And the third dimension is rational understanding related to appreciation of the context. So children early on might express bafflement, and they think there's no way to make sense of some past practices or institutions. It's just difficult to understand what was going on. We might then go on to say, well, we can explain it, but it's largely just by saying that people in the past were stupid or ignorant. Then we might move on to think about explanations by role or slightly stereotypical account of people. Finally, as we get into the more sophisticated stages, we think about explanations in terms of the logic of the situation, in terms of opportunities and constraints. Then, by reference to the way in which people at the time saw the action or institution being considered. And finally, that wider context of ideas in material life. Really, this relates to that developing sense of period that we were talking about when we were talking about chronology. So you add those 3 dimensions together and you have some sense of the conceptual demands placed upon children when we ask them to think rigorously about causation. But interestingly also, we get some sense of the challenge to us as teachers. So what do we do when we're teaching about causation? Well, in the literature, several people have noted problems and pitfalls that we need to avoid. So the first one of these is that causes can be seen as facts or events. So anything that happened before can be seen therefore as a cause, because in a sense it led up to the event that we want to explain. Now, that's clearly not the case, and by describing something as a cause, we are not just saying what happened, we are giving it some additional value. We're putting it into a constructed argument that it somehow led to something else. So it's important that when we're teaching about causation, we don't forget that it's about relationships and ascribing a purpose or a value in our explanation. It's not just noting that A happened, then B happened, and finally F happened. We need to be aware that many children are happy with a single cause, and the moment a single cause is fitted into their minds, then they think the story is complete. So we need to watch out for that and make sure that we keep reminding children to construct more complicated stories of causation. Sometimes, and I've used this a lot in the classroom, card sorting is useful. We might write different causal factors on separate cards and then ask children to group them by social, economic, political, or by long-term and short-term. And some of the people in the literature say that's fine, but it can lead to a simple categorization without encouraging children to think about the interrelationship between those factors. So to what extent have we really answered the question by saying empire happened because there were economic reasons and there were political reasons? But we need to really stop and think at some point how the political and economic were combined and how they worked on each other to reinforce each other as motivating factors. And then the next pitfall to think about is that we want to warn children against just a simplistic transfer of the scientific model of causation, because in history that tips over into a fairly naive notion of things being inevitable. It is inevitable that in normal laboratory conditions in a school, if we boil water, if we put a Bunsen burner underwater, it will boil at 100 degrees. That is inevitable. The heat causes the water to boil and release vapor into the air. But history isn't like that. When we claim we've got an account of historical causation, it doesn't work like that, because there is always free will, there is always a degree of agency, and there is always a degree of interrelationship between factors that might make things happen differently if the context changes. So we need to guard against that. And then 4 other things we need to guard against. Human motivation and human agency have to be promoted to counteract the scientific model. Children can be tempted to see history as something that happens to people rather than what people make happen. So we don't want to replace some broad notion of fate with the kind of momentous onward trudge of a thing called history. That we need to understand that history is rather the account we produce of the actions that people have already chosen to pursue. Next, some children may be able to differentiate cause from effect, but will be unable to explain the connection. So we need to always think about clarifying that. We need to be open to the issue of judging the significance of causal factors and recognise that that's difficult and it requires contextual knowledge. So how could you answer the question, were the political or the economic reasons for the decline of the British Empire more important, without really having a very deep understanding of context? It's not just about looking at the cards on your table and saying this is more important than the other. The actual criterion you would use to differentiate between causes is much deeper than that and draws on an awful lot on detailed knowledge of the period. And judging long and short-term causes and consequences can be difficult, so we just need to be aware that we don't breeze over these kinds of issues too quickly. So those were things to watch out for. What are some of the tips and suggestions in the teaching literature? Well, one suggestion is to teach the content and the context first. So it's difficult to explain why something happened until you understand what it was that happened. And then you can kind of work back and think about causation. So give the children some content, but then give them the opportunity to work with that content to construct their causal accounts. Second tip in the literature is to sort out cause and event cards and to pair them up so that children are actually physically relating a cause and an event together and talking about and justifying their selection. So we can sort and categorize cause cards, but as with the previous warning, we really need to think about what's the connection between those causes. We can ask pupils to think about why then and why not then. So why did the Civil War break out then? Why did why was Parliament dissolved? Why was there a scramble for Africa? And why wasn't there a scramble for Africa 150 years before? We can also use role play to develop rational understanding, but we need to make the context specific. So we can't just role play a king talking about the power of monarchy. We have to relate that to a particular period and to the challenges that were facing the monarchy at that period. We can use visual representations of the relationship between factors to try and really reinforce that notion of the relationship, and we can use past and present analogy. So we can think about something the children understand because it's happening and changing around them today. We can talk about why that change happens, and then we can transfer that to the historical context, although of course we always need to be careful that we don't introduce inaccuracies and anachronisms when we're doing that. So some of those teaching ideas were taken from these books, which are in your handbook reading list anyway. So what I'm hoping we're doing now is just starting to unpick some common sense concepts that we may well have taught why things happen. And if we're teaching from the textbook or from pre-prepared resources, it may well feel like we're listing those causal factors and that children are doing a good job by explaining that to us. But what I want to do is really use these kinds of references and teaching ideas to open up the possibility that we can do more explicit teaching and talking about the nature of causation and causal relationships than merely asking people to remember the reasons why something happened. And it's in that deeper thinking that real historical progression lies, and we'll come to that when we come to the reading in part 4 of today's lecture.